And so today, as we dive into this series, we're going to talk about taking back the table. And my challenge to you this week, or over this month, actually, as we come into the holiday months and you realize that Thanksgiving is around the corner, Christmas will be here before you know it. And this month, I thought, what a fitting month to talk about the role of the table. I don't know that I ever remember hearing a message on the table unless it was the showbread, the table of showbread. But there is something to be said. There's something spiritual about a standard table. A table that most of us have in our home. Yours may be 4x4. It may be 4x6. It may comes in a lot of different variety and ranges, different sizes. But the reality is that there's something that happens at a table that is spiritual in principle, and it's talked about in Scripture over and over, but it's easy for us to miss if we don't know where to look for it. It's easy for us to blow over it and not realize that there's some spiritual implications that need to apply to our life. And today, we're going to challenge you, we're going to challenge your family to take back the family table. And there's a couple of things we're going to ask you. We're going to ask you, first of all, to take a challenge, that over this month that you will engage in this challenge. We're going to ask you that as you engage in the challenge to put some pictures on social media, whether you use Facebook or Instagram or whatever you, some of you may still use MySpace, I don't know. But whatever you use, tag us in those photos. We want to see them. Each week we're going to give away some food cards. And so you'll be wanting to watch social media for that. At the end of the week, we're going to give away some food cards to those who post and share and participate. And at the end of this series, I think what we're going to do, I was going to give away a gift card, but I think at the end of this series, I'm going to pick one family that we're going to send a catered meal to your house. And we're going to send a home cook. We've got some cooks in this church that are and those ladies can cook, and I think we're going to pay them and we're going to deliver it to your house is what we're going to do. And so if you want to win that, I want to ask you to take the challenge this month. There's some keys that we're putting together. The first was we're asking you to eat 3 meals a week as a family, greater than 30 minutes at a time. And I'll tell you why we picked that number a little bit later. We're asking you to pray over your meal, every meal through this month, to spend some time and take a moment and to pray over that meal and ask God's blessing upon it. to spend time sharing around the table with one another, and then to spend time sharing your experience on social media. We're going to ask you to, as you sit at the table, to turn off the phone. We're going to ask you to turn off the TV and to focus on one another. And then we're going to give you some tools and some resources to do that with. Next week, Pastor James, he's finishing a series this week. And I told him that this series today, this is your intro to the series, and it's just kind of like the appetizer to a 3-course meal, and the real meal will start next week, but this is your appetizer. And next week, he's going to jump on board with this series. And so one of the things we're building for your little ones and for the nursery is a placemat for them to take home, and that you can put in front of them each meal. And it's going to have some different discussion questions that you can engage with as a family. This morning when you opened your bulletin, you opened your weekly, you saw this in there. This is table talk. This will change every week. Every week we'll give you a list of 10 to 15 different questions that you can use as starters around the table and you can engage with and begin conversation. To pick a question, to ask it at the table and let everyone go around and begin to unpack what they think or how they feel or what they would do, because there's something that's gleaned in spending time together, conversating. And on the back of that is, of course, the whole outline of the challenge. Take back the table. See, we're going to take back the table because we believe it's that time around the table is God-given, and that God has chosen to bless it and make it important, that there's things that we do around the table. Well, it's around the table that we're really able to disciple. It's around a table that we're able to reach into the lives of our children and in one another. It's around the table that we build healthy lives. It's around the table that we remember how good God has been to us. It's around the table that we can celebrate a time of being thankful. Far beyond just one day a year that we call Thanksgiving. But realizing that every time that our children are able to pull a chair up around that table, every time we're able to sit down, we are literally sitting in the blessings of God. And so this is your appetizer this morning. You see, one of the greatest discipleship tools God has ever given you is the table. It builds community in our lives and in our families. The table is God's gift for discipleship. It literally is God's gift into your family for discipleship. There's something powerful that happens around tables. It's around tables that we're able to connect, that we're able to form relationships on a deeper parameter, at a different level. It's around a table that we can grow spiritually. It's around a table that we can instruct and give wisdom to our children and our offspring. It's around a table that we can establish value, not only in their life, but for them to feel a place and a principle of belonging. I remember reading a story about Magic Johnson and Larry Bird, and if you didn't know that when they first started playing together, they didn't get along too well. They were both had very big egos, very sophisticated skill level, and both of them was constantly trying to outdo one another, and there was a great tension between these two great basketball players. And one day they were doing a commercial shoot, and they, of all places, they were doing it in the home of Larry Bird. And when it come time to take a break from the shooting, Larry's mom come in and she says, "Listen, guys, no one go anywhere." She said, "I made a meal for everybody." And they walked into the dining room, and there Larry's mom had the table set with food. And they all sat down around that family table, and they began to eat. And Larry Bird said these words. He said, "It was that day that I no longer knew him as Magic Johnson, but I knew him as Erwin Johnson. And it was that day that I got to know him and he became my friend." You see, the Bible says it this way. It says in Psalms 23 that, Lord, you prepare a table before me, even in the presence of my enemies. I will tell you that sometimes we often think about that as being able to lord that over our enemies and say, look at me, I've got food and you've got nothing. But I think sometimes there's something that happens when we're willing to sit at a table with our enemy, that sometimes they no longer are our enemy. When we take a piece of bread and we break it, when we begin to share food together, there is something powerful about sharing a meal. Do you realize that most of Jesus' ministry was done around a table? Because see, in our 21st century world, we see ministry always behind a pulpit, but Jesus did ministry most of the time around a meal. If Jesus wasn't sitting at a table or reclined at a table, then he was going to a meal or coming from a meal. 70% of his teaching involved food. Do you realize that? Jesus was known. Jesus ate good food with bad people. He ate with sinners and drunkards so much that the Pharisees created a little jingle about him in Matthew 11:19. A glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. That's what they said about Jesus. Jesus had no problem teaching from a table. Sometimes today we're so verse chapter oriented that we don't really understand. We have verses and we memorize, but we don't understand the story. Jesus taught in story because it's the story that's going to impact your life. It's the story that changes the way you look at your world. It's the story of the gospel. It's the stories that are communicated, the truths that are in those stories that have the power to shape not only our life, but the life of our children. Mealtime was a major part of people's life in Jesus' day. They didn't have electric lights. They didn't have television. They didn't have all the entertainment that we have. And so what they would do is when they would come in for that meal, they would spend hours there. I would even remind you up until the previous generation that the average dinner was 90 minutes long. And today in our culture, it's 12. And when you factor in cell phones and television, it goes even down less than that. In many cultures today, mealtime is still a major part. In Jewish homes, they celebrate their seasons and their festivals with food, as do many of us. But every feast is just that. It's a festival, a feast. It's about eating and enjoying the blessings of God because they tie to significant spiritual events in the life of them as people. Statistically, there's only 14 million people 14 million Jewish people on planet Earth. That's less than 2% of the world's population. But they have over 50% of the Nobel Peace Prizes. I could ask you why, and you can say, well, maybe it's because they know they're people. I would tell you it's because they know their story, and because they know their story, they know who they are. They don't spend their life trying to figure out who am I. They know who they are, and so when they get out on their own, they're looking for how they make that, by knowing who they are, how they make a difference in the world around them. They learn their story from a very early age. They understand they were once slaves. They understand how God brought them out of captivity. They understand the blessing of God on their life, and because of that, they have an identity that they learn at the family table. Take the Amish community. 95% of Amish children will stay in that lifestyle. That even though they see the outside world with all the bells and whistles, all the technology, they choose to stay in the lifestyle of their father and their grandfather because of the relationship that's built around the table. Amish homes eat at least 2 meals together every day. That they'll stop their work and they'll go in, and Dad will lead his family in a blessing. He will lead his family in stories from the Bible. He will affirm his children around that table. He spends moments in physical contact and singing songs together. And because of that, regardless of all the technology that pulls at them, they still choose the relationship over the technology. I remember the Waltons on television, one of my favorite shows. I love that time period, very hard time period in American history, the Great Depression. But yet in that storyline, how many of the integral interactions happen around a table? That mom and dad and grandpa and grandma would come in, and dad would be at one end of the table, grandpa's at the other, and all in between is all the kids. And they sit and they find out about each other's day and what's going on in each other's world. You see, the stats tell us today that most families only eat one meal together. That the average American eats 1 out of 5 meals in your car. And we see even on sitcoms today, I share with you the Waltons, but you see this vacancy. When you look at sitcoms like The Modern Family, you never see a family sit down around a table. The only exception I think I've seen to that in the last few years is probably Blue Bloods. And those guys tend to sit around a table and talk as a family. And then, of course, Duck Dynasty. And you know that's at the end of that, that's a big part of them sitting around a table as a family. You see, I believe our culture is hungry again for the family table. I believe that whether you agree with me or not, that your kids are hungry for the interaction that comes with the family table. But to have that in our life, there has to be something that we do as parents to make it a priority, to set it, to pay the price and establish it in our home. A few years back, Kim and I was in Orlando at General Council, and we had the privilege. It's one of those God moments that you just meet someone in an interaction, and the lady sits down beside Kim's, and this is a sea of people, probably 20,000 people in this room. And she begins to ask Kim about the scars on her face, and Kim tells her that she's walked through cancer and how God has blessed her, and the story begins to unpack, and this lady is walking through a scare with breast cancer. And Kim's able to spend time encouraging her and praying for her and staying connected, but the interesting part, well, not that that wasn't interesting, just adding to it was her husband was a church planter. They were in the Northwest. They were in the Seattle area planting churches, and they were planting churches around tables. That their whole church was done around a meal process. That they broke bread. They ate together every time they were at a church. You see, you look at that early church, and they often ate with each other every time they worshiped together. You see, we've stepped away from that. We stepped not only away from it in our homes, but also in our congregations, we've stepped away from it. But their whole church was built around the premises of us coming together and eating and growing, not only being fed physically, but being fed spiritually. You see, supper, remember when people used to call it supper? You see, you had breakfast, dinner, and supper. Now you have breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But the reason they use that word supper, it's the same word we translated in the King James. It meant to interact. Remember, Jesus said this. He said that, he says in Revelations on the screen behind you, he said, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door," he says, "I'll come in and I'll eat with him." The word that we translate in the King James is, I'll sup with him. I'll break bread with him. I'll fill, because it wasn't just, hey, have a bite of my sandwich. It was, let's spend time getting to know each other, because when we talk about supper, it was something that was spent over the course of hours to get to know the depths and what's going on with someone's life. There was deep layers of relationship that were pulled back and exposed, that they could know each other better. And Jesus says those very words. He said, if you'll open the door, he said, I'll come in and I'll have supper. I'll eat with you. Or he said, if I'll have relationship with you, I'll have interaction with you. It speaks to relationship. It's interchangeable with the word relationship. And so the family table is all about relationship. It's about a place to gather. See, Jesus discipled around a table. He told those stories around a table. And see, today he's asking us to be like him. I think the greatest meal that we know in the scripture is the communion. What we know of as communion comes out of the Passover feast that they were celebrating being brought out of slavery, being brought into the promised land, and God's mighty act of deliverance in their life. And it's on that night that Jesus is breaking bread with those disciples. He's in fellowship with them. They're in relationship. And if you look in John, you can see that he spends many hours teaching them. Many of it built upon the purpose and the person of the Holy Spirit. And how the Holy Spirit is going to be in their life and how he's going to strengthen them and encourage them and how he's going to lead them and guide them. And he spends about the time sharing with them about this new relationship. You see, they had spent time with Jesus. Many of their teachings had probably been over a campfire in the Judean countryside. And there in the flame, in the light of the campfire, Jesus would share with them about the truths of heaven, about the mysteries of the kingdom, about the revelations of God. And now on this night, he's breaking bread with them and he's preparing them for his departure. And he's saying, in just a few hours, I'm going to have to leave you, but I'm not leaving you like orphans. And he takes that piece of bread and he breaks it and he says, this is my body that's broken for you. It's one of the Passover passages. Some of you remember a series I preached several years back at Easter time about the Passover meal. And then he takes that cup and he passes it and he says, drink of this cup because this cup symbolizes my blood that the gospel, the new covenant is written in. In the early church, communion was a meal. We served communion a couple weeks ago and we do a piece of bread, a piece of cracker and a little bit of juice. If you come to get full off of it, you're going to be disappointed. Because it's just symbolic. But in the early church, they would gather and have a meal. They ate together. They broke bread together. They connected. They did life together. I would tell you it's something that we're missing. And not only are we missing it in our churches, we're missing it in our homes. You see, it's at a table that we learn about our culture. We learn about who we are. We learn about relationships. You see, we not only feed our physical bodies, but we feed the relationships at the table with stories and memories. I had a real neat experience just a couple weeks ago. I was at a sectional council, and there's some friends that we have in this in Laurel that actually go way back because they were friends with my grandparents when my grandparents were alive. And at this particular sectional council, it was just a few days before my birthday, and Sister Hartshorn is her name, and she had baked a carrot cake. Now, growing up, my granny's carrot cake was my favorite cake. I didn't want a chocolate cake for Christmas or my birthday. I wanted her carrot cake. And I told Kim when I sat down and I ate that first bite of that carrot cake, I said, I think this is Sister Hartshorn's. I know it's made from scratch. This one tastes like my grandmother's. And so I just have to confess to you that when I walked out that day, I had about 4 pieces of that. But I also let you hold me accountable. I didn't eat them all at one time. I stretched them out over a week. Actually, after I ate 1 piece, I held 2 back for my birthday. And on my birthday, I had the closest carrot cake to my grandmother's that I've had since she's been gone. You see, do you got a recipe? Is there something that somebody used to cook for you that you can't get anymore? I remember this feeling in here when we cooked the last bag of corn that my grandmother had put up. when you open the last jar of jelly because you know you can't get it again. There's no more to go around. My boys would tell you that there's a custom that we have on Christmas morning that we cook a little something called chocolate gravy. Now, before you judge it, if you like chocolate pudding, you'll like chocolate gravy. It's just that you serve it hot, but my grandmother would make it from scratch. My boys pretty much can make it, and we celebrate, and there's not a time that I eat it that I don't think about those memories. They were built around the table. Not just Christmas mornings, but they were built around tables. And those memories take me back to the lessons that I learned from my grandfather and my grandmother. You see, I'm just telling you, there's a lot of powerful memories you can build around the table, around a recipe, around a story. You see, every time those boys eat that, they know the stories that I've told them about their grandparents. Zach never met her. Ethan was just 5 when she left, but they know the stories that we've told. And they are forever connected to her through something as simple as chocolate pudding, or chocolate gravy as we like to call it. You see, I'm just telling you today that there's power. There's power in fellowship. And there's power around the table. That's why we need to eat together. Do you know that there's some benefits? Look at what on the screen, what studies have showed, that families who eat together talk more. It helps the children, it helps them stay connected and build better relationships. Parents who show up to eat with their children are more likely to express their love constructively in other ways. They are better at showing attention and supervision to their children. Family dinner offer kids more structure, thus creating habits that are beneficial. They carry over to the completion of homework and other assignments. Children of families who have family dinner are 50% less likely to get into trouble. That's worth it every day of the week. Being a part of a family dinner transforms individual members into a group. You see, it's just not us and them, but we are a family unit. And what happens is then your influence on your kids' life begins to rival the group that they're in at school, the peer pressure. And your advice carries more weight because you've sat at a table and you've broke bread together. You've sat at a table and you've shared deep truths together. You know each other's life, and it becomes a powerful place. Family dinner gives children the tangible security of belonging and being nurtured that is represented by the ritual sharing of food with those we love. And that's why when those who sit at the table with you betray you, that's why it hurts so bad. Like Jesus. Because he had broke bread with Judas. They had shared deep things. Here's some extra stats for you. Studies show that if you have 3 dinners, and that's why we picked it, 3 dinners together, that your child has a 40% less chance of being obese. They have a better likelihood of excelling in school, all from just having at least 3 meals together. Vanderbilt University did a study on kids that excel in reading, and what they discovered, they thought it was linked at first to kids who had bedtime story read to them. What they discovered, that it was not from bedtime story, but it happened to be tied to family dinners, and it was there at the family dinner engaging in dialogue that they learned to expand their vocabulary, and they learned how to interact with other people. They learned their manners. There's a generation who don't even know what manners are. And the only one that can take responsibility for it is the generation above them, because we just didn't teach them. Because it wasn't a priority. You see, the Bible starts and ends with food. It's not far into the New Testament. In the Old Testament that you find in Genesis chapter 2 that God puts man in the garden and he says, hey, you, eat anything you want in here, except that one tree. But he tells him, eat. Enjoy the garden. Enjoy what you have. Participate in it. And then did you realize the Bible ends with a big buffet. The marriage supper of the Lamb in Revelations 19:9. And the angel said to them, write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, these are the true words of God. Brother Danny, there's a meal prepared. Those are the true words of God. And it can only be heaven if there's no calories attached to it. Amen. Where chocolate cake is totally free of any calories, any sugar, but all the taste. You see, the Bible can be summed up. The Old Testament, in three simple thoughts. The Old Testament, they tried to kill us. We survived. Let's eat. And they celebrate. The New Testament, the very same way. I love you. I forgive you. Let's eat. Food is an integral part of Scripture because it's breaking bread that we become closer. It's in our DNA as Christians. I think it's why we're wired to fellowships. You see, life is much tastier than it has to be. You know, that's one of the things that has evolutionists and atheists boggle because you see, life, if we're just here, a creature here to survive, why do we have taste buds? Why does steak taste so good? Why does chocolate cake taste so good? See, it's not just about survival. We eat for pleasure because we have the ability in our being. God wired us that way to enjoy the taste of the things that are around us, to taste and see that the Lord is good. He could have made us like a snake. I remember growing up, we had a bunch of chickens and we had a couple of hens that had biddies all at the same time. And one night the sun had gone down, the time had changed, and it was starting to get cool. And they were looking, they would get out and scratch around the yard, but they couldn't find their way to get into the fence. And so my mom and my dad, they went down to the chicken pen. And Dad had leaned some tin up around the outside of that pen so weasels and foxes couldn't bury and dig underneath it. And Dad is looking around at something, and Mom has her hand up on a piece of tin, and she's trying to put the chicks through a little hole in the fence there. And she says, George, shine that light over here. And when Dad turns the light, she's trying to feed the little chick through the hole, and there's a big chicken snake who thinks she's trying to feed him, and he's got his mouth open. He's like, shove it in here. My mom screams and runs. If you're an animal lover, you may not like this next part. My dad picks him up by the tail. And my dad was good at cracking a whip. My dad popped him like a whip, broke his neck. Scared my mom to death. Game warden was telling my dad later, said, well, if he eats that one, he won't have to eat for a month. I thought, we could be like that. We eat one time and we don't have to eat for a month. But God said, no, I want you to enjoy food. We're wired, we're built to eat anywhere from 3 to 7 times a day, depending on the portion size. And we're also wired to eat together because psychologists show that there's nothing as depressing as eating alone. To sit at a table by yourself and to eat food. I tell you, as a pastor, I try not to eat alone. Because the food is not as good. Food is always better when you engage with other people. That's why connection nights are so important to us here at the assembly. And it's why, I hate to see that so many of us have stepped away from doing them because we need them in our life. Brother Jeff is kind of taking on revitalizing them. And next year, as we step into January, we're going to really do a push to get our connection nights back because we need you connecting with somebody. You need another family sitting at your table at least once a month. Sharing the goodness of God, sharing the deep things of God. So I'm challenging you to take back the table. Let me go through this real quick. What does it look like? Eat at least 3 meals together each week. And if you can't get your whole family, whatever is living inside your home, sit down. Now, if you're a husband and you travel, they have this great thing called FaceTime. We'll walk you through how to use it. Most of your phones have the ability now. If you've got a cell phone, you can FaceTime. So if you can't be there with your sweetheart, if she's traveling, you can FaceTime and be at that dinner with your family. I will allow you to sub out 2 breakfasts for 1 dinner, because usually breakfast is not as long. And if breakfast works better for you, sub out 2 of them for 1 dinner. But try to get together a minimum of 3 times a week. Make them last over 30 minutes, particularly if they're at dinner. Learn to say no to things that try to encroach on it. You can tell the soccer coach no. You can tell cheer no. You can tell the track team no. You can say, well, you're going to have to wait on us because my coach pastor, my spiritual coach, has told me we have to do this. Throw me under the bus. I don't care. Because I want, somewhere we're going to have to understand that spiritual principles are more important than physical principles. And spiritual things are I'm trying to prepare you for eternity, not to get your kids a scholarship. And I would hate to disappoint you if you knew how many athletic scholarships really got given away. Your kids got a better chance in band than they do athletics. Let me put a disclaimer on that. And that's not talking about the ability of your child. I have not criticized your child. I'm just telling you about stats and statistics. But I need you to understand that the principles I give to you from this pulpit are spiritual and they are eternal. And can I say this? They don't need to be brushed off lightly. I want to change your family dynamic. You may not have the memories that we talk about, but here's the great thing, you can begin to build them. So that when your kids get to where you're at, they say, oh, I remember what mom used to teach me around the table. I remember what I learned sitting at my grandparents' table. I remember. You get to build those. If you're single, I'm not letting you get out of this either. You can find someone to meet with. You can find another person. You can engage with someone else. I mean, tables are important. Whether you go to Match.com or eHarmony or Farmers Only, it's all about a table. That first date happens over a table. Unless you're on Tinder and that's all about a bed. That's like a meat market. Stay away from that thing. I'm just being real this morning. And then pray. I want you to pray over every meal. And not one of those, in Jesus' name, amen. I want you to pray. Now, you ain't got to stop the restaurant and say, can I have your attention? We're going to pray, guys. But take a moment and say, God, I just thank you for this food that I'm about to eat. But I also thank you for the relationships at this table. I thank you for what you've blessed us with. Even when you're alone, I want you to pray. And if you eat out, then I want to challenge you to another level of boldness. Look at your neighbor and say, be bold. If you eat out, I want you to look at that little server and say, hey, we're about to pray over our meal. We love to pray. Is there something that we can pray with you about or pray for you about? And you'll be surprised how that little act can change somebody's life. Well, yeah, I got a granny in the hospital. Or yeah, I got a sick kid at home that I had to come to work and because I got to have the money. I want to pray with you about it. You see, we need to learn to be people of prayer. And so many times we're quick to say, God is good, God is great. And we blow through that like it means nothing. I have a friend, we laugh at him and we pick at him. Because more than once I've watched him say, well, God, you know. And then we go to eat. I want it to have a little more substance than God, you know. That you remember his goodness and his faithfulness, his mercy, his grace, his provision, his love on your life. That you are bold and unashamed. That means that you're doing it at school. That means you do it on your job. And again, if you need to throw me on the bus, just say, hey, I know I usually don't do this, but my pastor has asked, and give him a phone call. I'll take it. Here's my number, 601-695-1204. Tell him to call me. I'll tell him it's your homework assignment. But I need you to be bold. I need you to live out your faith and let people see it. This world is looking. Now here's the dinner rules. No phones, no TVs. Turn it off. Put the phone in the room. If you're during the middle of the day and you're eating out, then put the phones in the center of the table. You want to have real fun with it, whoever picks up the phone first to check a message gets to pay for the tab. That's even better. See, we didn't do real good with that growing up. I was a nuclear family, and my dad worked at night many times in the fall. He would come home sometimes 9 o'clock at night, and so we would eat without him. Or if we were sitting often in front of the television. But as I shared with you before, it was at my grandparents that we always had to have the meal at the family table. My grandmother used something that some of you will never remember. You don't even know what these are. They called them serving bowls. And it had something that matched it called a serving spoon. And you didn't get food off the stove. No. It went from the stove into the serving bowl, and the serving bowl went to the table. And everything was put out across the table. So that once everyone sat at the table, nobody had to get up again until they were done. My grandparents always found room at the table. If they didn't have room, they'd set up another table, but everybody got to sit at a table. You see, can I tell you that God invented the table? Let me show you. Exodus 25:23. He says, you shall make a table of acacia wood. 2 cubits shall be its length, a cubit its breadth, and a cubit and a half its height. Up until that time, if you go on Wikipedia, they'll tell you that the Egyptians built the first table, but it was a short table. It was just to get stuff off the floor. It was just to get it out of the dirt. It's literally here that we get to the place where we're 27 inches off of the ground. And this is exactly the height of most tables today, 27 inches off the ground. And God gave it to it. He gave it to us because he knew there would be relationships built. And so we're asking you to have those meals, to pray together, and to share together. You see, the table is a place for discipling, for discipleship. It's for a place for godly training. Jesus, Matthew 26:20. When it was evening, he reclined at the table with the 12. It's there that Jesus shared questions, that he answered what was going on. It was there he told the story of life. In Luke 19:5, one of my favorite Bible stories, Jesus is going through a particular town, and there he runs across a wee little man by the name of Zacchaeus, who had climbed up in a tree because he wanted to see this Messiah. He wanted to see this Jesus Now, he wasn't a well-liked man because he was a tax collector. He was known as a thief and a robber among the Jewish people. But Jesus sees him, and he stops, and he sees this man who was willing to climb a tree just to get a view of this man who claimed to be the Messiah. And Jesus looks at him and he says, Zacchaeus, come on down. I'm going to have dinner. I'm going to have supper at your house today. Now, you don't understand the privilege to be able to host. You see, there's something prestigious about that. And Zacchaeus knew, I don't deserve to have a holy rabbi, someone who is holy, someone who speaks for God, to come into my house because I know that I'm a criminal and a crook. But yet Jesus chose to go. And it's at that table that Zacchaeus' life is transformed. How do I know it's transformed? Because he got up and he gave back everything he'd stolen, a double portion. You see, it takes a spiritual transformation to get into our pocketbook. I'll say it one more time. It takes a spiritual transformation to get into our pocketbook. And the powerful thing is Jesus does it all at a table. Sitting there, talking to Zacchaeus. He changes that man's life forever. At a table. Not a Sunday school room. Not a classroom. But a table. Your children, your grandchildren, your life has the potential of being transformed at a table. It was good enough for Jesus. It needs to be the same in our lives. What would you do if Jesus gave you the same instructions that I'm coming to your house today? I'm knocking on your door. I don't know if you've ever been at my house when somebody knocks unexpected. It gets a little crazy. Somebody's got to take one for the team. You've got to stop them at the door while we clean. You got to stop them at the door while we pack the closets full and tidy stuff up and shut doors. Red alert, red alert. Beep, 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 beep. What would you do if Jesus showed up at your house today? You see, he said this. He said, where two or three are gathered in my name, gathered at a table we gather. He said, you gathered in my name. You see, why we ask that blessing is not just to bless our food, but to bless the relationships, to take us deeper. You see, God gave us the challenge to disciple our children. And I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because you see, your children are the greatest thing you've got. And what you teach them, what you instruct in their heart is so important. In Jesus' day, they didn't have a lot of dessert. So what they would do is they sat and they talked and said, can I just tell you what you talk about at the table with your kids is so important. You see Jewish kids, they know their story. They know where they come from. They know their lineage. You see, your kids need to know they need to know your salvation story. They need to hear you talk about how you've discovered obedience and walking after God at times in your life where you wanted to go one way, but you stepped out in faith to go another because God spoke it to you. They need to hear it from your lips. They need to know their story and know that the God of the universe is just not a God in biblical text, but he's a God that you serve that's lived out by their mother and their father. They need to see it in our lives. And if we do that, it's literally, the Bible says it writes it upon their heart because it's just not empty words that are lived on a Sunday morning and they see you live it once a month or once a week. But they see it lived out every day in their life and they've heard your deep conversations. My boys know how I came to Christ. They know how me and their mom met. They know how I was called into ministry. They know the story. They can probably tell some of the stories of our life better than we can tell them. They need to hear your story. They need to hear the story of how Jesus has changed your life. Write it upon the tablets of their heart. Jewish families would literally take a stone tablet and they would take honey and they would write the word of the Lord on there. They would write the scriptures. And if a kid was good at the table, they got to lick the tablet. They got to lick that honey. For a little Jewish kid, at the turn of an era, that was the greatest thing. There was no Snicker bar, no Milky Way, but there's a tablet with honey. Most theologians think that's why David writes in Psalms and says, taste and see that the Lord is good. Taste and see that he's good. How will your kids see it? How will your grandkids see it? Because they've seen you taste. And you've given them a little bit. So they experience the goodness of the grace of God and you've talked about it. For some of you, it means that you're going to have to change your dynamic. Some of you have got grown kids and you need to have a family dinner with your kids and you need to say, listen, I have messed some stuff up. But you're too important to me not to have this conversation with you. That your spiritual soul is important to me. Well, Pastor, I want my kids to have choices. Listen, David said, Joshua said this way, for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. My boys got one choice. That is the way of the Lord. As far as me and my house, we're going to serve him. I'm going to finish today by telling you the Lord is good and he's sweet. His words are like honey on our lips. And today, maybe you're in this place and you don't have a relationship with Jesus. Maybe today you need to hear the words that I started with. Behold, I stand at the door and I knock. If any man will open the door, he says, I'll come in and I'll eat with you. I'll have a relationship with you. I'll know you. Some of us have spent a lifetime longing for relationship, and today Jesus offers it simply. Knocking. He said, if you'll open the door, I'll come in. I don't care if you've got a history like Zacchaeus. I don't care what the world says about you. I'm knocking. If you'll open the door, I'll come in and begin the relationship. Maybe that's you this morning. He wants you to taste and see that he's good.